Hi, everybody. This is Chris Stevens. I'm head of the mining law practice group and team at Worksmans Attorneys, a large law firm in South Africa. In my capacity as head of the mining team at Worksmans, I'm also head of the mining practice group of an alliance of law firms known as Lex Africa. For those of you who do not know what Lex Africa is all about, there is a website, and you're welcome to go and look at the website of Lex Africa to see what it's all about, but I will explain it briefly. It's an alliance of law firms initially established by Worksmans, and most of the bigger and important jurisdictions in Africa are represented on Lex Africa. So there's one firm from each of those jurisdictions which is represented on Lex Africa, and we have an alliance of law firms that we believe are firms of stature in each jurisdiction. As part of Lex Africa, we've also set up separate practice groups, and as I said, I'm the head of the mining practice group of Lex Africa, and the function or the purpose of these podcasts or these series of podcasts that will follow is really to deal with mining trends in Africa, and you'll hear from legal experts in the various jurisdictions regarding the trends in mining law. It's very topical, obviously, because of the fact that the Mining Indaba is taking place in Cape Town from the 2nd to the 5th of February, and all of the speakers on these podcasts will be down at the Mining Indaba representing their various jurisdictions and law firms at the Mining Indaba. So the countries that we're going to be dealing with or interviewing as part of these podcasts is obviously firstly South Africa, and I'll set the scene for South Africa. And then we'll go into Mali, Zambia, Mozambique, Zambia, and Tanzania, and legal experts in the mining field from each of those jurisdictions will be part of these series of podcasts. The other thing to note is that we've, as a mining practice group, we've produced a mining guide. We always update it every 2 or 3 years, and we've just very recently updated it, and that coincides with the Mining Indaba down in Cape Town as well. So there will be an updated mining guide that you can access on PDF in the website for approximately 21 jurisdictions, including all of the jurisdictions that are part of this series of podcasts. So what we've done is that we've set a series of questions for each jurisdiction dealing with all aspects of mining law, and each of the jurisdictions has answered the series of questions in accordance with their current legal position in regard to each of those issues, and it's quite a nice comparative analysis and a general introduction for anybody who's interested in looking into various jurisdictions from a mining law point of view. Right, so without much ado, I'm going to go on to the South African trends, and unfortunately, from a South African point of view, the thing that's most topical at the moment, of course, is the question of zama-zamas. Now, there's not really legislation that deals with zama-zamas, obviously, because it's illegal mining, but obviously it's a topic that is grappling the country, it's grappling the mining authorities, and there was even mention in the press very recently from the Minister of Mineral Resources, Mr. Mantashe, that there's a potential of some legislation coming in to deal with what we call artisanal miners or small-scale miners or informal miners. What that legislation is going to look like and how it's going to be implemented remains to be seen, but that's obviously very topical from a South African point of view. Another topical point in South Africa or issue is oil and gas. Oil and gas is dealt with in terms of the mining legislation. That's not common throughout the rest of the world. Oil and gas normally has its own laws, its own terminology, its own types of rights, and the Department of Mineral Resources is grappling with trying to extricate the oil and gas sections from the MPRDA and incorporate them in a separate piece of legislation. Oil and gas has also been topical in South Africa because of various court cases that have been held that have also been quite pronounced in the press, where certain exploration rights for oil and gas have been set aside by courts on the basis of environmental concerns and also lack of consultations with communities. And that leads me on to another trend in South Africa in mining law, is that the interests of communities have been enforced really in terms of various court cases which have demonstrated that a mining company has to take cognizance of communities and deal with communities to a large extent in obtaining their rights and consulting with these communities, and in some instances, depending on the rights that the communities have, to actually consult and get consent from the communities before being able to get a mining right or commence mining. So the topic of communities is highly relevant in South Africa, and the communities have a great say in mining, and so they should. If a mine comes and disturbs a particular area, especially if it's a rural agricultural area, there's no reason why the community shouldn't be integrally involved in the project. The next topic in South Africa, which is a fairly general topic but does obviously have an impact upon mining and mining laws really, is this recently announced act that's been brought into operation dealing with expropriation without compensation, and that it's a general piece of legislation or provision, but it does affect mining because mining rights themselves are property for purposes of the Constitution, and therefore one hopes that the expropriation without compensation will never be used to expropriate mining rights, but once again that remains to be seen. Then we're also going to, in each podcast, talk about in each particular jurisdiction who are participating in the podcast series about this aspect of resource nationalism. Now, a lot of people do not know the distinction between nationalism and nationalization. Nationalization is where the government actually effectively expropriates without compensation a mine or a mining right, and then runs it itself as the new owner. That's not what we're talking about here. Resource nationalism is a much more restricted concept. So what that means is that countries, and there are a lot of examples throughout Africa, have developed laws and policies which attempt to get benefit for the particular country from their exploitation of their natural resources, whether it's through employment, whether it's through taxes, whether it's through royalties, whether it's through ownership of mines vested in local population. That's what we mean by resource nationalism as opposed to resource nationalization. So there has been quite a trend, and one's seen a lot of news in the press about managing directors or CEOs of major mining companies being detained in countries because they haven't paid the super tax royalties, or so it seems like many jurisdictions are taking this concept of resource nationalism to the extreme. But in most jurisdictions, there's also a tendency towards resource nationalism. So once again, looking at a South African context, I think the government is grappling with the idea of trying to get minerals beneficiated in this country more than they are. If, for example, one looks at platinum or gold, those are refined in South Africa. We've got Rand Refinery that refines the gold. We've got Anglo Platinum and Impala who refine platinum and platinum group metals, and the very sophisticated beneficiation processes in South Africa, and obviously to the benefit of South Africa in terms of employment and foreign reserves, etc. But there are many minerals in this country which get exported out of the country without any beneficiation, and we lose the benefit of beneficiation and beneficiation activity. So the government is really grappling with the idea of trying to get companies to be forced to beneficiate in South Africa, or incentivized to beneficiate in South Africa. So that's one area of nationalism that I think will hit South Africa to a large extent. And there are ways and means of also controlling that. So there could be export duty if you export minerals. You may need the consent of the minister to export, for example. You may need an export license. So there are ways and means that they're going to try and incentivize or force companies to beneficiate in South Africa. The other aspect of resource nationalism is royalties and taxes. Obviously, South Africa has a fairly stable tax regime and also a royalty regime which has been in place for a long time, so there have been no real movements on that. But there are many countries in the world, and even first world countries, that have imposed super tax profits and royalties on mining companies. We haven't seen that in South Africa up to now. The other aspect of resource nationalism is ownership requirements. There are quite a few jurisdictions in Africa that have upped their requirements in terms of local ownership of mining companies, local ownership of mines, and indigenization requirements. There's also other corollary types of legislation that could be brought in, such as procurement obligations. For example, I know in the DRC, they recently imposed a regulation that said that all transport contractors had to be DRC indigenous transport contractors rather than foreign transport contractors. So that's just another example of resource nationalism, trying to get as much benefit for the country out of the mine in all aspects. In South Africa, we haven't got indigenization requirements in terms of local ownership of mining companies, but we do have the Mining Charter that's been around since 2004, and the idea was that at least 26% of the ownership of mining companies should vest in what is styled as historically disadvantaged South Africans, and that percentage has now been up to 30% for new mining right applications. So that's a form of resource nationalism, trying to keep portion of the ownership within South Africa invested in the hands of what is called historically disadvantaged South Africans. There are obviously also other aspects such as local content rules, community development, social labor plans that mining companies have to adhere to, applying back money into the communities. That's also another form of resource nationalism, because you're taking a portion of your profits and you have to put them into communities that surround the mine or the municipality in which your mining operation is situated. So that's a form of resource nationalism. There are also employment equity requirements, local employment requirements in South Africa, which are fairly stringent, and that's another means of making sure that there is benefit to the country and the citizens of the country via mining operations. So hopefully that's given you a sort of a brief introduction to the trends in South Africa and the extent to which we have what's called resource nationalism. If one looks at the mining guide that I mentioned earlier, we deal with various topics, and we give a brief outline of what the particular provisions are in South African mining law dealing with each of these particular topics. So we deal with what laws regulate mining law. We deal with the types and acquisition of rights. So you get different types of rights, for example, for reconnaissance, for prospecting, for mining, and we briefly outline what types of rights you get. Then the guide then goes on to deal with the oil and gas provisions, and as I said, currently it's in the mining legislation, but there are talks to get it out. We then deal with indigenization requirements, also any requirements for the state to hold ownership in mining companies. At present, there isn't any obligation at the moment, although in oil and gas there are rights of free carry in favor of the state. We deal with the processing and beneficiation provisions in South African law at the moment, and restrictions on exports of minerals. We deal with how to acquire rights by transfer, or are there any provisions which deal with disposals of rights and disposals of controlling interests of mining companies holding rights. Then we go on to the rights to use the surface of land. What rights does a mining company have to use the surface, and how does their relationship with the surface owner work? We then briefly touch on all the environmental aspects of a mining operation and what is basically required from an environmental point of view from a mining company. We deal with native title and land rights in favor of occupants of the properties, then health and safety aspects, and finally the constitutional administrative law aspects. Are there any administrative law provisions which deal with, for example, appeals against decisions taken under the Mining Act and how it dovetails with the Constitution? And then finally we deal with the basic provisions dealing with royalties. So you'll see that the mining guides for each of the countries that have contributed to the Lex Africa Mining Guide deal with all of these aspects in a brief form as well. And each of the companies that, or the countries, sorry, that are going to be contributing to the podcast will also deal with these aspects in short detail. But as I said, most of the detail is contained in the mining guides, which is on the website. So I hope you found this interesting, and I'm sure you'll find the other speakers to be of interest. They're major mining jurisdictions that are of great importance to Africa, and I'm sure you'll find each of their talks to be interesting in their own right. So thank you very much.